question. Just, Jason, thank you for that invitation, Jason. Just reminds me, I must update the blurb. The BBC Trust now no longer exists. I was an advisor to them, but since they're not there, I'm not doing it anymore. As Jason mentioned, I worked for many years in BBC Radio and TV and others. And as a scholar, though, I see myself and have seen myself as what we call a critical friend. I'm a great supporter of the BBC, as you'll see, but I'm also critical of it as well, as a scholar should be. And so what I'm going to say today represents if you like, the synthesis of my work as a BBC and my work at ITV News. I was there during the last election, but also my academic research in political communications. So a critical friend, here I go. So I hope you can all see my screen. Share, click. Right, please tell me that you can see, right. So a BBC organisation under a challenge. When I was first asked to do this presentation, it was a different time and place for us all. We are going to talk about BC and AC before coronavirus and after. The BBC was under real pressure before coronavirus, and I'm going to address those in the context of coronavirus. But first, what were those challenges? Well, the biggest one before December 2019, and why I say to December 2019 is when the new government was elected under Mr. Johnson, who, as I'm sure most of you know, is currently in intensive care in hospital as a result of suffering COVID-19. Before then, the biggest problem the BBC faced was the massive changes in the media landscape, obviously beginning with the digital landscape, but increasingly it is now the challenge from Netflix. And actually, if I'm very clever, no, I won't even attempt it. I was going to link the challenge from Netflix, from Amazon Prime, the streaming challenge in terms of changing, challenging, threatening their entertainment audiences, which is a really vital part of it, but also the challenge of social media, which is an immense problem for any mainstream journalist, both in terms of what we call supply and demand. Supply means they've got to constantly keep feeding the beast, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also they've got to keep abreast of it, of what it's saying. And a lot of the problems the BBC journalism has faced is not necessarily in their finished final packages, but in terms of their response to social media. There has been a lot of criticism over recent years. Well, it's not particularly new, but it's become particularly virulent because of social media. So there's been a huge change in the media landscape. Just in terms of budget, the BBC's budget is a fraction. They have £3 billion to spend on all their services. It's a fraction of what Netflix or Amazon Prime or Disney or whatever are going to change. So that was a huge problem for the BBC and has been for a number of years. And they have been responding to it in quite a positive way in many ways. And I'll come how they've responded to it in terms of coronavirus. But the audience is changing, which obviously relates to this, but young people particularly are not using the BBC, and particularly not using the live BBC, therefore not paying the license fee, which we'll come to in a moment, which is the main form of funding of the BBC. So the audience is, both its tastes and the way it consumes media is changing. So that's been another big challenge for them. Then I referred to the election. Every government thinks the BBC is against them. But when this government came in under Boris Johnson, there was a significant push, not just against the BBC coverage of the election, which they were unhappy with, but against the institution itself, against the notion of public service broadcasting, although nobody ever says it's against public service broadcasting. It's like the NHS, the National Health Service. Everybody's always greatly in favour of it before they start cutting its funding. And similarly, everybody's always in favour of public service broadcasting until they want to attack its funding. Their first attack was on the licence fee, which is the way it is funded, similar to NHK. They've actually set up a legislative process to nibble away at the licence fee in the first instance by making non-payment, decriminalising it. At the moment, it's a criminal offence not to pay the licence fee, but fewer than a dozen people end up in prison because of that, and they usually end up in prison because they've got a whole stack of other debts. But the government is putting legislation forward to decriminalise it, but it's a white paper, it's at the consultation stage at the moment. But they've also got a select committee, that's a committee of MPs, considering the future funding of the BBC. They've just invited people to submit evidence to them as to why the licence fee is the most suitable way of funding the BBC. If you take away the licence fee, or if you take away public funding, then the notion of public service broadcasting led by the BBC becomes problematic. But on the other side, on the liberal side, on those who support public service broadcasting, there's been a noticeable withdrawal of support. What I'd call its friends, those who favour public service broadcasting, were very disappointed, I'm generalising terribly here, for the BBC's coverage of our Brexit referendum, the referendum in 2016 when we left the EU, or we voted to leave the EU, and also their coverage of Jeremy Corbyn, who until very recently was leader of the Labour Party, and the way they covered the election. There were many on the left who were very disappointed in the BBC. The particular disappointment focused in terms of Brexit around something called phony balance, false balance, where they balanced the claims of one side based on research, based on science, against the other side, which was just based on slogans. In fact, Michael Gove, who is now a senior minister, said in a very symbolic quote, "I think the British public have had enough of experts." And that was greeted at the time at the referendum as a wonderful expression of public feeling. Now, of course, in the midst of coronavirus, we are desperately dependent on experts, and the government uses experts to justify every decision, even the controversial ones. They are maintaining always expert advice, so it's quite an ironic turnaround. And finally, there's the diversity of Britain, and I'll show you some figures in them. Oh, actually, no, I've skipped those, but clearly Britain is a very diverse nation in many ways, and there's a sense that the BBC has been broadcasting to middle-class, middle-aged white people. I mean, I generalise hugely because the BBC has made many efforts, but the perception is, and support amongst young people, support amongst ethnic minorities, support amongst poorer people for the BBC is less substantial than it is amongst other groups. Let me move on. There are the challenges facing the BBC, but of course coronavirus might have changed it. Now, for many of you, particularly international, you think of the BBC as news, but the BBC is much, much bigger. In fact, I dug up this slide, and I've noticed that actually one of the BBC's main and most important activities, BBC World on the radio and BBC World Service TV, is missing. But this is just a snapshot of some of the things it does in the UK. Television channels, you can see at the top, national radio channels, then local radio, then specialist channels to Britain's nations and regions, to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. The BBC Online, which I'll come back to, the iPlayer, which is that catch-up service, and so forth. So the BBC is massive. But let's just focus on television for a moment, or news for a moment.
We've done it this week, but if it's still like this next week...
Sorry, am I being heckled? No? Okay, sources of news. As you can see, there was a dramatic, this covers 2013, 2019. The most significant part of that graph is the dramatic collapse in newspapers, the purple line, down from 59 to 36%. People were asked, what is their primary source of news? You'll see, although television has suffered a gentle decline, it's still the main, and I'll come back to this, the main source of news, and the BBC is the main source of news. This chart, for well, understandable reasons, has separated social media, which has risen from 2013 to now 40%, the second most important source of news, but they've combined online with social media as well. So that includes myself, for example. I access newspapers online. So that orange is a very indicative line, because although newspaper sales have fallen, the number of people seeing them have not, because most of the major papers have now got major presences online, the Daily Mail, the Guardian, the Times, and so forth. So that's the major trend in terms of news consumption. In terms of brands, well, I think this chart is very interesting simply because just look at the top. The BBC dominates TV, radio, print, and online. This is what is your major source of news, and you can see. And the other significance on the left is that the public service broadcasters, and I do ITV News, I'm including Sky in that because Sky, and I had some experience at the early days of Sky, very much seeks to meet the same standards of the public service broadcasters. It is regulated, but not so intensely. But they have, they are the most used news brands for people asking what is their main source of news. So that is indicative of the importance of the BBC. And then we come to trust, and again we see, this is brand trust scores. BBC News is the top rated brand for trust, with ITV News second, the FT, and then Channel 4 News. So you can see that the BBC News remains the most trusted and the most used. Let me come to coronavirus now, and I think this has actually done very, very good things for the BBC, I think. We'll know afterwards, but I talked earlier about how this government has indicated in the, when it first came into power in December 29, how it had the BBC in its sights, and I think that's going to change. These three are the famous missions of the BBC: to inform, educate, and entertain. To inform, you will all be familiar with the BBC News website, one of the world's biggest, which has obviously come into its own. It has been, I've got some figures in a moment, very much central. People checking it. The government has a daily coronavirus press conference, which most people access direct through BBC News Online. But it's not just that, they've been doing special coverage. Here is their special coverage on COVID. It's been very comprehensive, very impressive. Just note it's also being used for, in terms of tackling fake news, as you can see, COVID-19, fake news. But that's on the inform side. I'll just mention, on the educate, the BBC has always played a major role in terms of education. It is doing sterling work at the moment. Some schools are still open for those children whose parents are doing nationally important work, health services and so forth. The BBC's brought back something that it ran a few years ago called Bite Size, and it's now, as you can see, providing data. Well, we're in the Easter break now, but it will be providing, beginning on the 20th of April, it will be publishing online lessons for all ages. And this is such a bonus, because although schools have been doing a lot of good work, this is for those whose schools perhaps aren't doing it or aren't doing enough. And there is education there, if you can see, age 3 to 11, 11 to 16, and post 16. Finally, on the entertainment side, excuse me, BBC has expanded dramatically its catch-up service iPlayer. It's uploaded a huge number of back catalogue box sets, running dramas, running special programs every night. And also, I'll call it entertainment, but they're doing a major fundraiser on April the 23rd to raise funds for the health service, and is making quite a significant impact in terms of its presence. During BBC News, here's some Havas, the international news agencies, collected some figures. No, this is BBC figures. They reached a total, this is BBC News Channel, reached 11.7 million viewers across the entire week. The significance, that is 70% higher than its average. That's the BBC 24-hour news channel. The BBC TV News at 6 has had an audience over 5 million, that's 27% higher. And BBC News at 10, an audience, an average of 4.1 million, 22% higher. And their other news programs have also increased. Research from Havas, the international PR advertising agency, found on a sample of 1,500, which is, as you know, significant for us researchers. The BBC has become the most trusted news brand on coronavirus, with 61% of respondents selecting it as a reliable source of information from a list of media brands. And 53% of British adults are using the BBC more than they did before COVID-19 hit the UK. That's more than double the proportion of any other channel. Now, the significance of these figures is this has not been generalized. When asked by YouGov on a sample of 2,300, do you think the overall quality of the media coverage of coronavirus is, to the left, good, bad, or neither? If you look at the men and women, not much difference. The total is 41%. This is generally for the overall for the media. So these aren't sensational figures, because 25% are saying bad coverage, 25% neither, only 41% good. But the significance of this figure, I think, is the cleavage between the under 40s and the over 40s. Only 30%, less than 1 in 3 of the under 44s, it's 45 plus. Should be under 45s, I think. But the data I got classified it as 44s and unders. Only 30% said it was good coverage, while almost half, 49%, said the quality of the media coverage was good. And 37% of the under 44s said it was bad. More than 1 in 3 thought the coverage was bad, whereas only 19% of the over 44s. Similar figures for neither. Oh, sorry, the last figure should be good, bad, neither, don't know. The last figure is don't know. Always done in a rush. So there wasn't a general increase in media appreciation of media coverage, as opposed to the increase in the trust in the BBC. And very similar figures to be found in the USA. This is a comparison of figures from the UK and US. This is how much do you trust the information about coronavirus that you've seen from journalists and commentators. On the left is don't trust at all, and on the right is completely trust. And you can see blue is the UK, red is the US, not a huge difference. So we've got a trend here of trust in the BBC going up significantly, but it's not an international trend, and it's not a trend that extends even across the whole of the British media. So let me conclude by just revisiting these challenges and just reflecting briefly on how they relate to the BBC. Well, the changing media landscape, online and offline, I don't think there's much the BBC can do about that, although it is significant. Some figures I saw literally a couple of hours ago suggested that audience figures for BBC drama, this is not coronavirus, but over the last year, of the top 10 most watched shows in the UK, none of them came from the streaming services. They were all either BBC or ITV or Channel 4. They are the 3 main public service broadcasters. So although the streaming services are significant, they're not yet biting into the public service broadcasters' audience figures significantly. Overall terms, what they are doing is biting into the audience figures and the support from young people. And of course, that's crucial because they're the ones who are eventually going to be older, and they're the ones who are going to be required to pay the license fee. So their support is not there, their support is ebbing away. And that's the ongoing problem the BBC faced. Just a word about radio. BBC has actually done extremely well in terms of podcasting, and they do have a significant audience, young audience for its podcast. So yes, I jumped ahead of myself. So young people are the problem. That's not a generalization. Young people are not committed to the BBC. When I say to my students who watched this last night, they look at me quite blankly. And I even often have to describe what a newspaper is to them. So the audience is changing, and that's a big problem for a mainstream broadcaster. The government now, I think the government will row back on their offensive against the BBC. They'll possibly have to go ahead with the decriminalising licence fee, but even that, I think they might try and put it on the back burner and say not for now. I think this will have blunted the serious attack on the BBC. The government seem to be mounting. Similarly, the Labour Party coverage of the BBC is obviously a minor thing, but they have changed their leader from Jeremy Corbyn, who was seen as very left and people regarded the BBC's coverage of him as hostile. They've now got a more centrist leader. That might help. Brexit, which was a huge divide of the nation, is obviously taking a back seat. So I think support from its friends will return, I think maybe not such big numbers, but enough. So I do think the BBC has shored up its position. And finally, and of course everything is speculation, I think the coronavirus crisis has brought the nation together. I think the Queen's broadcast, which was seen by 24 million, was of significance. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister going into hospital was seen as a unifying moment. And like in many other countries, there is every week a national demonstration to support the National Health Service. So it is a sense of the nation coming together. On the other hand, and this will be my final point, I think the damage that the economic shutdown has done, particularly and will do to poorer people, to the deprived, whose rates of dying from coronavirus is higher because they're often in more exposed places. So I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish. I don't want to say everything's going to be okay, because I think there are major challenges ahead. But in terms of those facing the BBC, I think coronavirus, and this is slightly sick to say, but I think coronavirus will have helped the BBC, but obviously at a horrendous cost, which all of us wish hadn't had to be paid. So that's my contribution. Happy to take part in conversations and debates, and I've hit my 20 minutes. Thanks very much. I will now stop screen sharing. Oh, I don't.
Thank you very much, Ivor. And yeah, you also had a brush with coronavirus yourself, I understand. So thanks very much for doing it in these circumstances, but you're looking fine. So next we're going to move to Kohei Tsuji, speaking from Tokyo. And we've kind of got the opposite problem in Japan, haven't we? Because there, the NHK is being criticized for being too close to the government rather than being criticized by the government itself. But I'll leave it to you to explain what's going on.
Thank you for the introduction, Jason. Before I start, I'd like to show my deepest sympathy to all the British people who are listening about what your Prime Minister Johnson is going through right now. You must be feeling unsettling and uneasy, regardless of your political views. I assume especially difficult because Prime Minister Johnson is such a cheerful character, and that is what you need the most in this difficult time. I hope he will recover soon and get back to number 10 to lead the country and to his pregnant girlfriend. A little bit of myself. I was a fellow at the Reuters Institute at Oxford University until last week, and I came back to Japan 6 days ago. I am staying at the hotel right now, self-quarantine right now. Now I'll go back to my newsroom in NHK. That's a Japanese public service broadcaster. Well, anyway, so let me start my presentation. Okay. There we go. Are you seeing it? Can you see it all right? Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the role of public service media in the age of coronavirus. And first of all, I want to talk about three things today. First one is NHK under attack. Ivor mentioned about how BBC is under attack, and NHK is not exception. That's the first thing I'm going to talk about. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of coronavirus had on public service media. And then I would like to end with what will public service media would look like after coronavirus. So let me start with the first one. I just want to give you a perspective that maybe not all of people who are joining the webinar know what the NHK is, just to give you the perspective. In terms of budget, it's almost similar. BBC has £4.9 billion and NHK has £5.3 billion. This is all figures from 2019. Number of employees, the group total, BBC has about the double of NHK. They have about 22,000, and NHK has 10,000 employees. In channels, depending on how you count it, but in terms of national, excluding the world service, BBC has 8 channels, NHK has 6. BBC has 11 radio channels, and NHK has 3. Just to give you idea of what it looks like. NHK is also funded almost entirely by license fee, just like BBC. The price of the license fee is also almost the same. It's a bit higher. It's about £190 a year. It's very similar in terms of size. Now, in terms of trust, this is the figure from Reuters Institute, where I used to belong. If you look at the trust scores of all the major media outlets, NHK sits on top, meaning it's the most trusted media. And having said all of this, I want to move on to the topic of NHK under attack. I'd like to talk about this man. His name is Takashi Tachibana, and he's the leader of a political party called Protecting People from NHK. This is the name of the party. He used to be an NHK employee and became sort of a quote unquote whistleblower of how corrupt NHK is. And he started this political party in 2013. The single agenda of this political party is to dismantle license fee system and turn it into subscription model, meaning that you pay only if you watch NHK and allowing people not to pay if they don't. And this is to undermine the fundamental structure that NHK stands on. Just like I've explained, BBC is facing this threat about subscription model, and NHK is the same, pretty much the same. And who are these people? As I mentioned, they were established in 2013. Their agenda is to change the license fee model. And basically, not many people took them seriously until last year, summer into 2019, when Japan had a parliamentary election. To many people's surprise, this party won 1 million votes, and they won 1 seat and now has 2 seats in the national parliament, along with 37 local MPs. It's not like they are part of government or coalition or anything, but it's an alarming sign. And there are many explanations about why this party was able to get 1 million votes from the people. And one of the convincing ones is that this is coming from anti-establishment sentiment. There's no doubt that NHK is part of the establishment, and many people think that media elites who don't understand the suffering of ordinary people, and they have difficult feelings about these people and institutions. I just want to move on to 3 points, how they gain support. It's one of the golden rule of journalism. If you want to understand something, you need to follow the money. So I explain who is funding this party. The answer is quite simple, actually. It's regular people who is funding them. This party makes many video clips attacking and making fun of NHK and post them on YouTube. And because those videos are entertaining and make some people feel better by watching showing his bank statement, which proves that Google has been paying about $100,000 a month as an advertisement money for YouTube. So that's how they get the money. Their strategy is to appear on media as much as they can. They put, whenever they have elections, they put candidates on constituency, so that when the media covers this district, they will get the coverage as well as the ruling party and the main opposition party. And they even established a call center to tell people how to evade paying license fee if they want to. Now he's going through many scandals, and they are not being able to impact government policy, but threat is still there. I think this is something unique in Japan and NHK, so I just wanted to introduce about this. I want to move on to the issue of coronavirus. I've already mentioned some of the points that I'd like to make, but I just want to focus on 3 things. First one is TV ratings and online access. And the second one is changing trust. And third one is younger audience. Allow me that some of the issues are overlapping with Ivor's presentation. But I'm going to show you some numbers. This is the access of this is the data collected by EBU. Many of you might know that EBU is the Alliance of Public Service Media Organizations, which has 116 member organizations in 56 countries in Europe and beyond, including NHK. And this survey done in the mid-March, data was collected from 18 public service media in Europe. So as you can see, there's a huge spike in TV ratings and online access. Basically, the reach of evening news doubled, and online access increased by 270%, and that's pretty big. If you look at the NHK, I just compared the ratings of NHK Evening News 7 o'clock. That's main flagship evening news. In March 2019, we had 14.1%, and March 2020, we had 22.4%. So that's went up by 8 percentage points. It's not quite doubled, but if you have worked in TV industry, you probably know that 8 percentage points are still significant difference. And on top of it, we keep special programs and current affairs programs on coronavirus, and ratings of those are extremely high as well. We need to keep in mind that this rise in ratings are probably due to the fact that way more people are now staying at home for self-isolation, and they have plenty of time to spend to watch TV and check news. So I don't know if this will continue, but this is what we see now. Now I want to move on to the issue of trust. Trust is there's no secret that trust on mainstream media is eroding all over the world. And we see something different here as well. So this is a survey done by American PR firm Edelman Trust in the mid-March. They asked people where they get information from about coronavirus. So as you can see, major news organization sits on top by far, higher than government sources and almost double compared to social media. If you look at Japan, which I highlighted in the square, 73% of respondents said that they get information from major news organizations, which is the case, but it's becoming less and less. But I'm quite surprised about this high number of the news sources. Major news organizations are most relied on in terms of the information source. And next, I want to move on to the reaching to a younger audience. This is also a survey done by EBU. The young citizen turning more to public service media, evening news in times of crisis. Daily viewing went up by 20% average. We all know that younger people stop watching TV. They don't watch TV anymore. So this change is significant. So this is a small good news for public service media in this difficult time. Now, given this high ratings and a lot of access online, I'm going to tell you what NHK is offering to these audiences. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm just gonna introduce two things. First one is called NHK Full School. So Japan was one of the first countries to shut down all the schools in the country, and children needed to study at home. So NHK created this website that you can still continue your study at home. I just want to draw attention here with the circle. It's in Japanese, but it just says science. And the number you see next to it says 3,555. I know it's very small, but it says 3,555. Means this is the number of video clips that we have. And you can choose from according to your grades or curriculum, you can choose the clip accordingly so that kids can continue the study. And here, this is also in Japanese, please forgive me. This says the subject. So if you click on this, you can choose whether you want to study math or science or social studies. You can choose a subject. And then here you have, it says grade. So if you are 6th grade, you just pull down the menu, you choose the menu, and you click on the video. So this is NHK Full School. This is what we're doing in the Corona times. And next one is Chinese language service. NHK always had the Chinese language service, but this is especially important in times of crisis. Japan has lots and lots of natural disasters. Like we have lots of tsunamis, not lots, but tsunamis and many, many earthquakes, typhoons, the floods. Almost every year we have very severe natural disaster. When we have a natural disaster, you need the information about where you can get food aid, where you can get the temporary shelters, or how you can get access to these various services that government is providing. But if you are out of information loop, it's very hard to get these services. And there used to be, there are only information in Japanese and sometimes in English, but there are quite large number of Chinese population living in Japan who doesn't speak Japanese nor English. So they started services in different language so that the necessary assistance would reach these people in time of crisis. And this is the same with the coronavirus as well. Government is now announcing a lot of assistance, economic, financial assistance to the people who lost their jobs and things like that. And they need to know how and where they can get these services. And I just want to end with the quote from Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist. He says, there's the word BC before Corona and the word AC after Corona, and we have not even begun to fully grasp what the AC word will look like. I thought this quote illustrates the world we live in very well. So many things have changed in our lives because of coronavirus. And some of those changes will remain even after when this would all end, as it will someday, hopefully soon. So my main takeaway for my presentation is this. So some of the changes that we are observing with the public service media, which I introduced in my presentation in after Corona world, will it remain, or which part of it will remain, or will it all go back to the way it was? I don't have an answer to this in terms of regaining a trust, or in terms of reaching to younger audience, or even the impact on what kind of funding model we should have. These are all open questions still, but these are very important questions that we need to be asking after coronavirus. Thank you for listening. So that's my presentation.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Kohei. Great, well, thank you very much, particularly to Iva and to Kohei for taking the time to put together those presentations. I think it's been rather fun.